Imagine receiving the news that your grandfather's been diagnosed with breast cancer. You attend a consultation visit with him at the hospital, and your grandfather seems convinced that surgery in tandem with chemotherapy is the right way to move forward, assured by an over 95% success rate in men with a similar diagnosis. You head home, and the next step is to wait for a phone call to schedule day one of his treatment. A few days later, when this phone call comes, things are very different. Your grandfather is adamant he's no longer interested in receiving any treatment. In the days between the consultation and that phone call, he went on the internet to learn more about breast cancer, and he found convincing posts and stories that he could get better simply by intermittent fasting and cutting out sugar from his diet. His body would heal itself, so no need to deal with the side effects of treatment. You, his doctors, and other family members struggled to convince him otherwise, and it isn't until a steady progression of debilitating symptoms that months later, he comes around to asking for conventional treatment. But at this point, it's too late. The cancer has spread, and the case is deemed terminal. This story, and others like it, are what motivated me to spend the last 4 years designing and conducting research to study how people use the internet to inform their health-related decisions. Everyone here has, likely at your fingertips right now, access to a huge compendium of knowledge, the internet, that we can use to inform the way we live. Yet, although we have access to many of the same websites and search engines, we often come to different understandings and even form distinct, polarized views of important topics, such as those relating to health. Like, for example, is eating meat good for you, or is it gradually shortening your lifespan? You could likely find a compelling case on the internet for either. Sometimes it goes beyond simply holding different opinions. People form completely different conceptions of reality based on what they perceive can and cannot be trusted in their online information ecosystem. To study this further, I use eye tracking technology to see how people look at a screen, to see how they go about finding health information online using a small infrared camera directed into users' eyes that can tell us where they're looking on a screen. The data output looks something like this. So, as you're likely able to assume, the red dot indicates where the person is focusing. And from the screen recording, we're able to see things like the search terms people use, the websites they have an option to click on, as well as what they ultimately click and read. The eye tracking adds an interesting layer where we can see what actually grabs people's attention throughout this process. We combine this data with interviews where participants explain their thoughts and reasoning behind their behavior while they watch a video of their own eye tracking data. In doing this work, I've come to find that even when people might be viewing the same information, they're often not really seeing the same thing at all. And this can have a dramatic impact on what they take away from what they read. In my first eye tracking study, we brought in 40 people to search the internet on the best ways to boost their immune system. Today, I want to highlight 2 participants who, despite starting on the same webpage published by Harvard, ultimately come to 2 distinct views of the best things they can do to avoid getting sick. Here's how that happened. So here's a rendering of participant 1's data, where each bubble represents a point of focus, the numbers represent a sequence, and the size represents how long they spent looking there. I include this visual just to show you the depth of data that we're able to get with eye tracking, but to help you follow along with my talk, I converted this just to heat maps. So participant 1 here, you can see they glance at the title. They spend a considerable amount of time on that first paragraph, but then their attention catches a bullet point list later down, so they skip a section and move there to get at the information faster. Whereas participant 2 on the same web page tends to distribute their attention a little more evenly across the big block of text. Now, what's important to note here, in that segment that participant 2 reads, and participant 1 did not in this case, is where the authors explain that there isn't really super strong scientific support for any specific nutrient or remedy in enhancing our immune function beyond general principles of healthy living. So things like taking care of good sleep habits, having good exercise behavior, and having a varying diet that are good for our general health can thus contribute to a regularly functioning immune system, but there's not really a strong base for anything that you can expect to keep you sick above that. And this provides important context for the bullet point list that follows, as well as the rest of the page. Now, moving down further, participant 1 on the left, again, they spend time reading that first paragraph, which mentions there are some vitamin deficiencies that might alter immune function, before once again, their attention's caught by a segment on stress further down, so they skip a section in the middle. Whereas once again, participant 2 reads a little more fluidly across the page. And again, important to note that in that section, participant 2 reads and participant 1 does not, is where the authors explain that there's not really strong scientific consensus for a relationship between vitamin deficiencies and altered immune function in humans at this point. So let's just say there's not really a strong basis at this point to spend money on particular herbs or supplements with the expectation they'll help you from getting sick less. Again, besides those general principles of healthy living I talked about before. Though these reading differences might seem relatively minor, the downstream effects in this case were actually quite significant. So participant 1 went on to spend the rest of their 15 minutes on a couple of commercial websites that explained how they can buy certain supplements to enhance their immune function, whereas participant 2 went on to spend the rest of their 15 minutes on a couple of health organization web pages discussing the relationship between diet, immune function, and sleep. Unsurprisingly, when we asked them for their final answers on the best way to boost their immune system, they emphasized the things they spent time reading about, which in this case produced answers that differ markedly from each other. Yet in their interviews, both would tell you their opinions are informed by science, and in this case, specifically informed from the same webpage by Harvard. In a world without access to our own eye tracking data, we often assume when we read something, we're updating our beliefs objectively and accordingly. Yet in reality, my data shows that only a fraction of what we see online really garners attention, and this can differ meaningfully between people. In this way, our pre-existing biases and our digital habits don't just change the way we judge what we read online, they can fundamentally change whether we're seeing things at all. Sometimes what we're noticing or not noticing makes relatively little difference on our impression of a page, but other times, like in this example, it can significantly shift opinions and thus alter real-world decision-making on topics like this. So, should you find yourself out in the world encountering people whose views differ significantly from your own and you have a hard time grasping how they could get there, remember an example like this. It's quite possible that they're encountering much of the same online information that you are, but it filters through everyone's attention quite differently. Indeed, I would bet that if you were seeing the same information through their eyes instead of your own, you would have been just as likely to arrive at these same conclusions. Now, while it can be good to hold empathy and develop understanding for how people can come to form different views than ourselves, how can we go about helping people avoid forming views that stray from what is objectively true? In the case of health information, this can mean helping people avoid being persuaded by things like misleading marketing tactics that run rampant in the wellness industry, or from uptaking medical advice that is based on anecdotes and strays far from what we know to be scientific consensus. One way in which we might help people is to actually expose them to more false and misleading information. This is based on something called inoculation theory, a term first used by William McGuire and Demetrius Papagorgas in the 1960s. It's based on a metaphor with vaccination, so just in the same way that we can expose somebody to a weakened strain of pathogen and thus boost their immunity against it should they encounter it later on, by exposing people to contextualized forms of false and misleading information, we can similarly enhance their ability to avoid being persuaded by it should they see it in the future. As an example, say you come across a popular post that tells you toxins in the food you've been eating have been building up in your body, causing you to feel run down. And a juice-based detox cleanse you could purchase would be the best thing to help refresh that energy. Indeed, millions of dollars have been spent on remedies just like this. Now, if you've never encountered something like that before, it might sound quite reasonable and compelling. But say before, I had showed you many examples of the wellness industry using pseudoscience to manufacture fear, often paired with selling a solution. A red flag might pop up in your mind, and you'd approach a post like that with greater skepticism. Now, to see how this theory actually might change people's attention, we brought these same participants back from that first eye tracking study, the same 40, and we showed half of them a video with many examples of false and misleading types of health information so that they'd be better able to identify it and discard it in another search. We sent them back on the internet for another 15 minutes to answer a different health question, and sure enough, their eye tracking data showed us that those who saw the video spent more time scrutinizing a source before they would click on it, and generally spent less time overall on things like commercial web pages and sponsored blog posts compared to the previous search, as well as compared to those who didn't see the video. In other words, exposing them to some misinformation beforehand made people slow down and think more critically about what they were reading. In another study, I incorporated some examples of health misinformation into an undergraduate class right here at McGill, which also included having the students come up with some deceptive writing of their own so they could come to appreciate how easy it can be to use anecdotes and pseudoscience in a misleading way. By quizzing these participants before and after the class, we were able to see that the activity improved their ability to distinguish a science-based versus a commercially biased source of health information, which is a key skill if you're going to make good evidence-based decisions based on what you read on the internet. Taken together and put atop other research being done in this area, there's mounting evidence that if we want to help people avoid being persuaded by online misinformation, we need to heighten their awareness on the types of misinformation that are out there. And we need to expose them to real-world examples of it in a setting like a classroom so they're better prepared for when they will undoubtedly see it later on their own devices. If you want to be able to leverage the internet as a positive force for informing the public about health-related topics, we need to empower people to be able to recognize what is and isn't worth giving their attention to from a science-based perspective so they can confidently go about making their medical and health-related decisions based more on facts and less on falsehoods. Thank you.